What's up, y'all? Now that all my finals are done with, I get to make videos every day, and I was gonna make this video right after UFC 310, but because that's when my final started, it's been delayed till now. In this video, if you haven't read the thumbnail yet, I'm gonna rate every single UFC pay-per-view throughout 2024 strictly on enjoyability. How enjoyable the main event was, how enjoyable the main card was, how enjoyable the prelims were, and if the press conference leading up to the event was exciting. I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's jump right into UFC 297, Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis. I'm going to put this at the B tier. The main event was a sick fight. Uh, Sean Strickland, I did think win that fight initially, but looking back at it, I think du Plessis winning was better for the sport because du Plessis is an overall more entertaining fighter than Sean Strickland. The press conference was actually really funny because Sean Strickland and some Canadian journalists were going back and forth. This Canadian journalist was trying to get a headline out of Strickland for saying homophobic or transphobic statements. However, he quickly realized that nobody really cares in the MMA space. But the reason I can't put this above A tier is because Raquel Pennington versus Mayra Bueno Silva happened on this card. I watched this fight back just to make sure I'm not being too harsh when I say this, but these two women are a disgrace to women who actually want to pursue a career in mixed martial arts. Other than that, you had a couple of highlights though. Mike Mallet for the feature fight quit in the last 30 seconds of his fight with Neil Magny, and all Canadian men went 0 for 7. And also the main card opener, which I'll talk about briefly because I've discussed this in other videos. Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev. I'm still pissed off to this day that Mark Goddard does not know what a grounded opponent is because he stepped in on a position where Allen could have potentially finished Evloev in the third. Could have been a lot better if Mark Goddard didn't ruin everything and if Mayra Bueno Silva versus Raquel Pennington wasn't 5 rounds. But overall, not a bad card. We move on to UFC 298, Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria knocked out Alexander Volkanovski in the second round, which I did not expect happening, but I'm kind of glad though it happened because Ilia Topuria really put himself on the map in my opinion after this. And the overall card was a banger. We had Robert Whitaker go to war with Paulo Costa in the co-main event. We had Merab Dvalishvili versus Henry Cejudo for the number one contender fight at bantamweight. And for the main card opener, Anthony Hernandez choked out Roman Kopylov in the second round. The only fight on the main card that wasn't too good was Jeff Neal versus Ian Gary, but I'm not gonna fault Ian Gary for the performance because I know a lot of people will. Listen, I still really like Ian Gary's style, but what are you gonna do? Step in the pocket with Jeff Neal? That's practically suicide. But as for the prelims, Amanda Lemos versus Mackenzie Dern, relatively entertaining fight for a women's fight. Was it fight of the night worthy? Goodness no, but it was pretty good. Overall, this should be the standard for a UFC pay-per-view. High level main event, banger co-main event, a relatively strong main card overall, couple of entertaining fights in the prelims, and yeah, that would make for a gold standard pay-per-view. The only reason this is not in S tier, however, is because there are a lot better pay-per-views later throughout the year. We move on to UFC 299, John O'Malley versus Chito Vera. I don't think this was the best pay-per-view of the year, but at the same time, I think this card is a lot better than every other pay-per-view that will wound up in the A tier. Sean O'Malley put on an absolute clinic against Marlon Chito Vera in their fight. Did I think O'Malley was going to win? Yeah, but I didn't think it would be that one-sided and that dominant for 5 rounds straight. As for the main card, you had Peter Yan versus Song Yadong as the opener, Jack De La Maddalena versus Gilbert Burns, Wicked Knee JDM through the last 30 seconds of their fight. For the feature fight, Michael Venom Page versus Kevin Holland. MVP styled on Kevin Holland for the course of 3 rounds, which I did not expect because a lot of these guys who come from other organizations like Bellator or PFL don't do very well in the UFC. And on top of that, Dustin Poirier earns himself a title shot after knocking out Benoit Saint Denis in a scrap of a 2 round fight. Even in the early prelims, there were a couple of bangers, like Curtis Blades saving us from a leatherhead over here who is incapable of hurting people with punches. Kyler Phillips sent Pedro Munoz an early retirement package by schooling him on the feet for 15 minutes straight. And Michelle Pereira caught the body of Mikhail Olasechik in under a minute in the early prelims. One of the best main cards of the year, and a couple of highlight-worthy finishes on the prelims. Not the best card of the year, but I can't really name that many cards that are much better than UFC 299. On to UFC 300. I think there's no debate for this card. S tier. You had a couple of historic moments during this pay per view, like Alex Pereira knocking out Jamal Hill in the first round, and you had Max Holloway hitting a buzzer beater KO against Justin Gaethje in the final seconds of the fifth round. Overall, I still believe that UFC 299's main card was more enjoyable than UFC 300's. However, the difference comes in the prelims. Top to bottom, the prelims of this card were absolutely stacked, and almost every fight the prelims ended with an exciting finish. Notable performances on the prelims include Yuri Prohaska dog walking Alexander Rakic, Renato Moicano beating the life out of Jalen Turner before getting on the mic to talk about Austrian economics and financial motivations. Finally, Diego Lopez starching Sadiq Youssef to get himself into the featherweight rankings. Top to bottom, an amazing card. My only problem with UFC 300 was that Bo Nickel versus Cody Brundage was the main card opener. But other than that, I got nothing to complain about because the prelims were objectively the best out of any pay per view, and the main card was, while I think overrated, still very good nonetheless. On to UFC 301, Alexander Pantoja versus Steve Usyk. I think this pay per view was hella underrated. I'm gonna put this in the B tier. Now, on paper, like Anthony Smith, this card was supposed to be absolutely abysmal. Let's be honest, the only reason this card got any hype was because Jose Aldo was returning after a 2 year layoff. But the fights overall, very entertaining or very high level. Steve Usyk looked crisp against Alexander Pantoja. I thought Usyk got robbed at the time, but watching the fight back, I can kind of see why the judges gave it to Pantoja. And as for the co-main event, Jose Aldo did not disappoint us whatsoever. From start to finish, he outclassed Jonathan Martinez, and he looked ready to get right back into the top 10 at bantamweight. Anthony Smith in the feature fight handed undefeated Vitor Petrino a fat-ass front check. Not gonna lie, I was kind of raging because I put a 5 leg parlay for this card, and the only leg that did not hit was Vitor Petrino knocking out Anthony Smith. Michelle Pereira hit a nasty backflip over the corpse of Io Portieria after dropping him in the first round. And finally, Caio Borralho sent Paul Craig to the Shadow Room. And the prelims, you got Caveman Maitabek Orobai having a war with Elvis Brenner. You had Joe Anderson Brito go out and demolish Jack Shore. And as for Mauricio Hufi, he gave us a Conor McGregor-esque spectacle against Jamie Malarkey. Not the best opposition, but yeah, Mauricio Rufy looked really impressive out there. Overall, a couple of highlights on the prelims and a generally entertaining main card. My only issue was that there were no name valued fighters on the event because let's be honest, half the roster is from Brazil, yet the UFC for some reason could not get anyone outside of Jose Aldo with actual name value. But yeah, I can't complain about the fights itself because they were very entertaining. We move on to UFC 302, Islam Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier. Now, Dustin Poirier versus Islam Makhachev was a top 5 fight of 2024, which is why this card is not going in the F tier. However, the rest of this card, crash. This pay-per-view completely stunk before the main event. Paulo Costa just backed away for 25 minutes while Sean Strickland spazzed out in the middle of the octagon, throwing only jabs and teeps. Kevin Holland broke Mikhail Olasechic's arm with an armbar, which was probably the only other highlight of this card other than the main event. Even the fights that I was somewhat excited for, like Roman Kopylov versus Cesar Almeida, kind of ended very stale because Kopylov broke his hand early into the fight, and yet Cesar Almeida does not know how to defend takedowns against the striker who broke his hand in the middle of the fight. Zero knockouts and three submissions across 12 or 13 fights, and most of the decisions were relatively boring. Shout out to Poirier because he's one of my favorite fighters ever. Other than that, I could care less about UFC 302, which is why we're going to move on to UFC 303. Alex Pereira versus Yuri Prohaska 2. I'm going to put this in the B tier. This card was not bad at all, but I feel like the UFC could have definitely done better for this. The prelims were great. Vinicius Oliveira, Ray Saruya, Gene Silva, Joe Pyfer, and Peyton Talbot really stood out in the prelims. But the main card was really lackluster, in my opinion. The only highlight-worthy fights on the main card were Alex Pereira versus Yuri Prohaska, and ironically, Moira Bueno Silva versus Macy Chasson, when Chasson cut up Silva with a nasty elbow, only for the fight to stop prematurely. The feature fight between Roman Dolidze versus Anthony Smith. How do you make Roman Dolidze look like a world-class striker? And yet you're still somehow top 10 at light heavyweight Anthony Smith. And the main card opener, Ian Gary versus Michael Venom Page. I didn't think that fight was a barn burner, but I don't think it was that bad. It just did not live up to the expectations because there was some heat going into this fight. Unfortunately, MVP does not do anything jiu-jitsu wise. So yeah, like turned into a relatively boring jiu-jitsu match for especially in the third round where both of the fighters were kind of gassing out. Neither fighter really threw any strikes. There were a total of 6 strikes per 5 minutes on both sides. This was hyped up to be one of the best cards of the main year of the year, but it did not deliver whatsoever because when you compare it to every other big card of the year, it doesn't even come close. Moving on to UFC 304, however, Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad 2. I'm gonna put this at the A tier. Now, I know what you're thinking. Like, Bilal won, and it's dark times for the welterweight division, but Bilal, remember the name, had a relatively entertaining fight, for his standards at least. I was genuinely impressed with what Bilal did. He picked up Leon Edwards and dunked him on his ball spot, which made for some funny ass edits. And as for the rest of the main card, fun fights everywhere. Tom Aspinall knocked out Curtis Blades in like 2 minutes. Paddy Pimblett twisted Bobby Green up like a pretzel in the first round of the feature fight. Gregory Rodriguez, aka Obama here, put on an absolute beating against Christian Leroy Duncan. And finally, Arnold Allen clutched up against Giga Chikadze to get himself back in the win column in a relatively back and forth scrap. The prelims were also fire. Uh, the heavyweight GOAT Mick Porkin got his first TKO against I forgot his name, Bukowskis or something. Nathaniel Wood put on an absolute masterclass against Daniel Pineda, and the Welsh gangster Oban Elliott did his thing, beating Preston Parsons up in a relatively exciting back and forth scrap. One thing I will mention though is that the arena seemed dead, especially towards the main card. And I understand it though because the UFC for some reason put this event at 3 a.m. UK time. This card was very good, but unfortunately, for some reason, Dana White wants to torture the English fan base. But then again, that shouldn't take away from what Bilal Muhammad did. Relatively entertaining card. On to UFC 305, Dricus Du Plessis versus Israel Adesanya. I'm going to put this at the B tier. That main card is what really saved UFC 305 in my opinion. You had the opener Carlos Prates versus Li Jingliang. Uh, Prates knocked out the Leech. Really sad to see for Leech fans like myself. But yeah, Prates became a notable force in the welterweight division following that knockout. As for Tai Tuivasa versus Jarginho Rosenstrike, a pretty good fight considering both of these guys are morbidly obese heavyweights. The feature fight, Dan Hooker versus Mateusz Gamrot, top 10 fight of the year. I do think Gamrot won looking back at it, but that shouldn't take away from the fact that these two guys went to absolute war with each other. And in the co-main event, Kai Kara France unfortunately knocked out Steve Erceg. Listen, it was a very good fight, but I was just sad that Steve Erceg got knocked out like that. Finally, we had the main event: Dricus du Plessis coking out the dog molesting, ethnicity switching, fridge race baiting Israel Adesanya in the fourth round. And I was nervous for Dricus because it was very close going into that fourth round. But DDP pulled through and latched up that rear naked choke, submitting Israel Adesanya for the first time in UFC history. If only the highlights of the prelims did not show Herbert Burns butt scooting and Junior Tafa being a retard and not knowing that the ref is going to step in if you verbally scream in pain while your opponent is going for a submission attempt. Again, atrocious prelims, but the main card was really good, and I think it deserves some bonus points for it. So I'm going to put it at the top of B tier at that. We move on to UFC 306, Sean O'Malley versus Merab Dvalishvili. This fight card was pretty good, but I'm gonna have to put this at the C tier. Now, the prelims once again were goaded. Joshua Van stepped up on short notice against Edgar Shirez to put on one of the Fight of the Year contenders for 15 minutes straight. Ignacio Bahamondes brought out his inner Sean O'Malley and knocked out Manuel Torres with a step back right hand in the second round. Hell, even Norma Dumont, a women's MMA fighter, put on a striking clinic against her opponent, Irene Aldana, which was really impressive considering most women's fighters don't really do that, especially against Irene Aldana. As for the main card, the first three fights were insane. Daniel Zellhuber versus Esteban Ribovich. I was thrashing Zellhuber throughout the fight because he kept constantly like throwing his fingers into Ribovich's eyes every time Ribovich would try to step in forward because Ribovich is the shorter fighter. But man, does Zellhuber have a chin because I don't know how he survived that beating that Ribovich put on him in the third round, but hats off to Zoe Huber nonetheless. And for the feature fight, the Eagle, Brian Ortega, almost got slumped out by Diego Lopez, the only one threatening enough to beat Ilya Topuria, in my opinion. Where I have my complaints, however, is with the co-main and main events. My adrenaline died watching Shevchenko smudge up Grasso on the canvas for 5 rounds straight, and Marab winning the bantamweight title the way he did, not really what I was hoping for because I wanted Sean O'Malley to get a highlight reel KO so that we get some fun super fights in the future. These two fights were the most important ones, and yeah, that's why it can't go higher than B tier because those two fights seriously sucked. On to UFC 307, Alex Pereira versus Khalil Rountree. Had Alex Pereira once again not stepped in, this probably would have been a god awful pay per view. The only fights worth giving praise outside of the main event was Joaquin Buckley versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and other than that, abysmal dog shit. This card really pissed me off on so many different levels. Pennington actually performed decently and somehow got robbed. Jose Aldo beat the absolute life out of Mario Bautista and somehow got robbed. Like it's a meme that the refing and judging in the UFC is atrocious, but for some reason, all of these atrocious refs and judges decided to gather together here at UFC 307. The only reason this card is not going to the F tier is because of Alex Pereira versus Khalil Rountree. Khalil Rountree put up a hell of a fight against Pereira, which, let's be honest, saved UFC 307 because Roundtree was supposed to be knocked out in the first two rounds according to odds. In a way, Roundtree showing up to put up a better fight than Jamal Hill and Yuri Prohaska was really entertaining to watch. But yeah, other than that, this card really pissed me off, so I don't want to talk about it anymore. UFC 308, Ilya Topuria versus Max Holloway. No debate here, automatic S tier. I'm gonna argue that this card was even better than UFC 300. The main card, in my opinion, was a lot better. You had Ilya Topuria knocking out Max Holloway. Hamza Chimaev buzzsaw through Robert Whitaker's jaw and broke it with a face crank alone. In the feature fight, you had Magomed Ankalaev versus Alexander Rakic. Like that fight was not that entertaining, but I'm not gonna fault Ankalaev like most people are because it had to do more with Rakic just backing off for 15 minutes straight. And in the opener, Shara Magomedov hit a Mortal Kombat-esque TKO over Armin Petrosian with a double spinning back fist. Oh, and my highlight. Who could forget about this fight? Mateusz Rebecki versus Maitabek Orobai. Fight of the year, no debate. If you haven't watched this fight, please go watch it right after this video because that's all I'm going to be talking about. I don't care about the rest of the prelims because this fight alone automatically puts this card at S tier. Man, these guys put on a hell of a performance. Fight of the year, and you don't even have to go over the rest of the prelims, but the rest of the prelims had some entertaining fights, which is why this fight card was arguably the best of the year and possibly the best pay per view of UFC history. I know there's a few other ones that are way before my time, but in recent memory, I can't name a better pay per view than this. On to UFC 309, John Jones versus Stipe Miocic. John Jones beat up on a senior citizen in Stipe Miocic with a cool spinning back kick. You don't really see that in heavyweight MMA, which is why I'm going to give John Jones a lot of credit. That being said, why is 42-year-old Stipe Miocic lasting longer in the cage than the supposed number one contender, Cyril Gane? And of course, the few chances Stipe Miocic got, John Jones reverts back to his eye-poking tactics immediately. Like, I don't understand why more people don't call him out for this, but a lot of people like John Jones, I guess. Charles Oliveira dog walked Michael Chandler in the co-main event, despite Chandler cheating throughout the whole fight. Yeah, I hate Chandler. Like he could go to the GFL for all I care. Bo Nickel versus Paul Craig. Man, this fight was complete garbage. Like, please stop putting Bo Nickel on the main card UFC. Please. Viviane Araujo versus Karine Silva. Like it happened on the main card of UFC 309. Please stop putting women's MMA events on the main card UFC. The opener between Mauricio Rufi versus James Longtop, it wasn't that bad. It just kind of got hairy towards the third round. James Longtop has a hell of a chin because a couple of these shots I thought Rufi was gonna put him away, but yeah, James Longtop kind of came in very overweight, which is how he was able to tank those shots in my opinion. But yeah, like the prelims though, going back to it, very entertaining overall. Jim Miller latched up the nastiest guillotine I've seen in a while against Damon Jackson and Oban Elliott. I think he's gonna get a ranked opponent at welterweight soon because he knocked out Basil Hafez in one punch, which is crazy to say. The prelims again, very good. But man, that feature fight and the second fight of the main card was completely garbage. Finally, we get to UFC 310, Alexander Pantoja versus Kai Asakura. This was a really good card, but I think I'm going to put this at the A tier. The prelims were arguably the second best of the year. The only stinker was Brian Battle versus Randy Brown, but other than that, I think every fight on the prelims was relatively enjoyable. My favorites were Joshua Van versus Cody Durden, Vicente Luque versus Themba Gorimbo, and I'm gonna have to give my props Aljamain Sterling versus Movsar Evloev. I don't like Evloev as a person or his fight style, but this fight was pretty fun to watch. The main card really underdelivered, however, which is why this card can't be at the S tier. The main card wasn't bad, but when you compare it to every other S tier pay per view, it's just objectively worse. The judges rigged the absolute shit out of the feature fight between Cyril Gane and Alexander Volkov. Somehow, Cyril Gane gets his ass whooped for rounds 2 and 3 and still wins a majority decision. Again, this pay per view was not trash. You had a couple of highlights like Kai Asakura getting choked out by Alexander Pantoja in the second round. You had Bryce Mitchell sending Chrome Gracie back to Gi Jiu Jitsu, which is really good for the sport because stop putting Chrome Gracie in main events. And finally, my Korean brother Doo Hoo Choi beat the absolute hell out of Nate Landwehr in the main card opener. I was really impressed because I did not expect that from Doo Hoo Choi. But Doo Hoo Choi looks really good, and I'm gonna make a video about this later. But I think he can get far into the featherweight rankings. Yes, the prelims were very nice, but the main card, when I compare it with the other S tier pay per views like UFC 299, UFC 300, and UFC 308, it just does not compare. Yeah, I think that's all for today. I'm gonna be making a tier list about all the fight night cards throughout 2024. Let me know in the comments if you agree with my opinions, what events you would put higher or lower down the list. But other than that, or I will try to get that fight night tier list before Christmas, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.